Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 26th of August of 2026. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where during the previous 24 hours the Russians have improved their positions significantly. First let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction. The Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours the Russians destroyed a very important warehouse on the territory of the Dnipro agglomeration. This video was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, and here we can see a very big explosion that took place somewhere in the northeastern parts of the Dnipro agglomeration. Most likely the Russians destroyed a warehouse. Another important thing is that the Ukrainians announced a mandatory evacuation through the area to the south of the city of Zaporizhzhia, and we're talking about these territories. So the villages, let's call it like on the Ukraine side of the river of Dnipro, where force started mandatory evacuation. So all these villages, the Ukrainians would try to make empty as soon as possible, with the purpose to deploy most likely additional troops, because the Russians most likely in coming days will begin the second phase of the western Zaporizhzhia direction offensive. We're talking about this territory. Another important thing is the situation through the northeastern flank of the city of Orekhov. I would like to remind you that during the previous days we received lots of very interesting updates and reports, and this is the way how the map has been adjusted since the 24th of August of 2026. First, we received the report that Russians established complete control over the settlement of Dolinka. This information was confirmed between the 23rd and the 24th of August of 2026. Then, during the Independence Day of Ukraine, the armed forces of Ukraine carried out a counteroffensive operation in the area of the village of Verkhnya Tersa, and as a result of this counteroffensive operation, several pro-Russian sources claimed that the Russians lost control over these two villages. But at the same time, the next day, during the 26th of August of 2026, pro-Russian sources reported that the village of Nizhenka was taken by the Russians under complete control. Furthermore, this information was confirmed both by the Minister of Defense of Russia and by this video, where we can see how exactly the clashes for the village of Nizhenka were taking place. In this video we can see how the Russians first were pummeling the village itself, and during the final part of this video we can see at least a Russian soldier with the Russian flag. So we see that currently there are very heavy clashes for the Verkhnya Tersa bridgehead. So the Russians are trying to take the river under complete control, and the Ukrainians are trying to save positions on the Russian side of the river. So that is why there are very heavy clashes, but the Russians continue advancing. Furthermore, several pro-Russian sources claim that the Ukrainians organized another counter-offensive operation, this time in the area of the village of Ternovata, and as a result of the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to take these territories under complete control, and these are the changes on the ground between the days. So one thing is clear, that currently there are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are trying to make everything possible with the purpose not to allow the Russians to take under complete control the territory between two rivers, the river of Verkhnya Tersa and the river of Gaichul, but the Russians, despite attempt from the Ukrainian side, continue advancing. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation through the Drobropillya direction. During the previous 24 hours we received lots of very important updates, and probably the most important thing is that the current commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Dropatyi, assigned two generals of the 5th, probably of the 3rd or 1st corps. In coming days we will receive additional details for the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk Druzhkivka defense operation, which means that the Ukrainians began their major reinforcement of positions through the Slavyansk Kramatorsk direction. The Ukrainians began redeploying additional troops and forces in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to concentrate everything they have just with one purpose, not to allow the Russians to take the Slavyansk Kramatorsk-Druzhkivka agglomeration before the end of 2026. So in coming days the main part of the battle begins. The Ukrainians concentrated significant number of forces. The Russians have done the same, and now we'll see the final phase. We will understand whether the Russians indeed are able to finish the battle during the 2026 or not. At the same time, we start receiving reports, very interesting reports published by pro-Ukrainian sources that first sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to improve their positions significantly through the northern Drobropillya direction, and first Russian troops were spotted in the area of the settlement of Bilozerske, Novovodiane and Zolotoy Kolodets. As for the settlement of Bilozerske, this is a very important situation because currently this is the most important logistic hub for the siege of Drobropillya and for the battle for the siege itself. And if Russians are able to sabotage and reconnaissance groups are able to cut the territory between the settlement of Bilozerske and the siege of Drobropillya, this may lead to complete collapse of defenses of the armed forces through this area. So the battle for the Drobropillya intensifies, but the most important thing that due to the fact that the Ukrainians began a major reinforcement of this area, the Ukrainians most likely first of all would organize a counteroffensive operation in the area of the siege of Drobropillya with the purpose to stabilize the situation, to recapture the initiative and to force the Russians to fall back. So the main battle, the beginning of the major battle for the Donbas Arc operation begins, and this battle begins with the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation in the area of the siege of Drobropillya. Meanwhile, the Russians continue attacking the cities of Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk with aviation, with FABs. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates. But the most important thing, the most important report of the previous 24 hours is that the Russians, if you remember, sent several sabotage and reconnaissance groups to understand the situation around Druzhkivka. And yesterday we received the report that one of the sabotage and reconnaissance groups answered the siege of Druzhkivka, and the Ukrainians suffered huge losses among their FPV drone operators' crews. This is a very important situation, which means that probably there are already several groups of sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation through the entire agglomeration, and most likely this means that the battle for the agglomeration has already begun. Meanwhile, we received the report that several bridges in this area were destroyed by Russians. At least we received the report that a bridge between the city of Slavyansk and Balbasovka, so basically between the city of Slavyansk and the mainland, was destroyed by Russians as a result of aviation strike. In this video we can see the damage that the Russians dealt to the bridge. The bridge hasn't been destroyed but badly damaged. Most likely the Russians in coming days will repeat their attacks and they will try to destroy the bridge completely. This will probably worsen the logistic situation and capabilities of the armed forces of Ukraine through this area. Furthermore, we received a report that the Ukrainians began evacuation or continued evacuation, and that the Russia has significantly increased their shelling of Slavyansk with multiple launch rocket systems, FPV drones in recent days. So now the Russians are using all types of weapons, all means they have, with the purpose to attack the Slavyansk-Druzhkivka agglomeration, because the Russians know that the Ukrainians are reinforcing this area, that the Ukrainians have lots of soldiers in this area. So that's why the only thing the Russians need is to increase their firepower through the agglomeration, and obviously if they increase the firepower, and due to the fact that the Ukrainians have concentrated huge manpower in these areas, obviously this will lead to casualties and losses from the Ukrainian side. Another important thing, that's the announcement of the reinforcement of this area we received right after pro-Ukrainian sources began publishing information about the end of the northern Lyman counteroffensive operation. If you remember, just yesterday we discussed that the Ukrainians, according to pro-Russian sources and neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian sources, managed to improve their positions through the northern Lyman direction. They haven't managed to finish everything things they were tasked for. They haven't managed to cut the salient and to force the Russians to fall back on the eastern bank of the river of Zherebets. The Russians managed to repel the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation, and I would like to point your attention that the units that were involved in this counteroffensive operation and commanders that were involved in this area, Dropatyi decided to redeploy in the direction of Slavyansk, Druzhkivka and Drobropillya. So the Ukrainians, the units that were exhausted during these battles, right now the Ukrainians are trying to redeploy in the southern direction, which is also not a very good situation for the armed forces of Ukraine. Anyway, let's wait and see how the things are going to develop, but it seems that in coming days we might see the Russian counteroffensive operation with the purpose to recapture and to restore control over the territories that the Russians lost during the battle of the Ukrainian counterattack through this territory. Now let's move further and let's talk about the northern directions. During the previous 24 hours, the most important updates we received from the Sumy direction, where the Russians improved their position significantly. During the morning, the pro-Russian sources reported that as a result of clashes, the village of Pysarivka was taken by the Russians under complete control. Furthermore, we received this video where we can see a village of Pysarivka itself, and here we have a moment when a Russian soldier raised the Russian flag right exactly at this point, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. Based on this video, based on the report published by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and by the Group of Forces North, we adjusted the map. Furthermore, several pro-Russian sources clarified the situation on the ground, and according to these changes, the Russians began outflanking the settlement of Khotyn from the south and from the southeast, trying to cut the main logistics of the armed forces Ukraine through this area. And probably due to this configuration of the front line, we believe that the Russians most likely in coming days would be able to finish the battle for the settlement of Khotyn as well. And if it happens, this is going to be basically a total collapse of the Sumy northern front line. From these positions, the distance to the first buildings of the city of Sumy itself would be less than 12 kilometers, and when talking about the Sumy agglomeration, the distance would be just 6 kilometers. If Russians answer the village of Druzhkivka, this is going to be the beginning of the battle for the city of Sumy itself, and this is going to be the moment when the Ukrainian authorities would be forced to announce the mandatory evacuation of the city of Sumy itself, and this is going to be a significant media victory, first of all, for the Russian side. As for the eastern and the southeastern directions, during the previous 24 hours, small changes were recorded in this area. The Russians intensify aviation strikes through the settlement of Kramatorsk-Drobropillya. More videos were published on this matter. We have FPV drone crews of the armed forces of Ukraine that were attacked by Russians. It seems that in coming days, the Russians may intensify their attacks through this territory as well. At the same time, we see that the Russians began the northwestern Sumy offensive operation. During August of 2026, lots of changes were recorded along these routes of attacks. The Russians furthermore established control over the settlement of Rizhovka, and it seems that from this direction the Russians are tasked to cut physically the R44 road and railways that go from the city of Kyiv towards the settlement of Sumy, and most likely in coming days or during the autumn or winter military campaigns, the Russians would try to improve their positions through this area as well, with the purpose to reduce the Ukraine's logistic capabilities. So the situation is quite critical. We see that the conflict is entering the final stage of the summer military campaign. We see strikes, lots of missile strikes carried out both by Russians and by the Ukrainians. And the most important thing is that during the 26th of August of 2026, the Ukrainians attacked the city of Donetsk. The sources reported that up to 12 missiles of Flamingo type were recorded through the settlement, and according to different sources, the Ukrainians were attacking the central part of the city of Donetsk, and as you can see, this attack took place not during the night but during the daylight, when people were returning back from their jobs, from their works and so on, and the attack took place in the most populated part of the city. So this is another video, but from another angle. As you can see, lots of vehicles, lots of civilians were moving and driving from their works to homes, and during this period of time the attack took place in the central part of the city. Most likely the attack, as for now we don't know for sure about casualties from the Russian side, but most likely in coming hours we will receive additional numbers, and we will discuss once again this attack during the next video. But most likely this is going to be something like a trigger for Russians, and most likely due to this attack we must expect another massive attack, probably even during the upcoming night between the 26th and the 27th of August of 2026, and most likely the Russians would attack the city of Kyiv. During the previous 24 hours, the President of Ukraine Zelensky stated that they managed to discover a launching site of Iskander missiles from the Russian side, and to attack this launching site between the 25th and the 26th of August of 2026, and maybe this is the reason why the Russians didn't attack Ukraine with missiles during the previous night. So let's wait and see how the things are going to develop in coming hours, because most likely this thing will only deteriorate. Now let's move further. Another important thing worth attention, that during the upcoming hours something important is going to take place in the area of White Sea. The thing is that during the previous 24 hours lots of reconnaissance aircrafts were recorded through the Baltic Sea, through the Baltic states, and through the airspace of Finland. Lots of reconnaissance aircrafts of NATO countries and European countries were recorded, and as you can see all of them were flying through the northern around the northern regions of Russia. And the thing is that the Russians scheduled something in the area of Arkhangelsk region. For example, on the 24th of August of 2026, on the 21st of August, we received a report that Russia issued maritime navigation warning, closing several areas related to the Arkhangelsk region for missile launches on August 26th and 27th. The warnings established temporary danger zones but do not specify the type of missile launch platform or specific targets of the test. So something is going to happen within the next several hours. Furthermore, I would like to point your attention that during the same period of time, we received that the Russians are going to start testing the Poseidon missile system. A Russia submarine built to launch Poseidon nuclear drones begin sea trials, and this situation took place on the 17th of August of 2026. And so everything is possible. The Russians are planning some drills to test some missiles. Either this might be the Poseidon missile system or even something else, something more powerful or more dangerous. So that is why we see so many reconnaissance aircrafts in this area, and obviously they're doing just one thing, trying to understand what the Russians are doing and how the Russians are going to do this. And most likely, and several military experts reported that the drills that are going to take place between the 26th and the 27th of August of 2026 in the area of the White Sea were the main reasons why the CIA director Ratcliffe came to Russia. During the previous 24 hours, we received a lot of reports that he came to Russia with the purpose to talk about ceasefire, about energy truce, about probably prisoner exchange, and many other different things. But several military experts reported that he came also about mobilization, but he came to Russia to discuss drills and weapons that the Russians are going to test and use in the area of White Sea. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to happen next. But during the upcoming 24-48 hours, the Russians may use something powerful, much more powerful than the Oreshnik system, and most likely a submarine would be a carrier of this type of weapon, and this probably may change the situation and the understanding of the Western countries regarding the statement that's about strategical defeat of the Russian Federation during the conflict on the territory of Ukraine. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.